On February 2, 1660, inside the cold chambers of Blois, Gaston of Orléans, brother to a king, a prince who once dreamed of seizing the crown, breathed his last in silence. There was no triumph, no state funeral, only the quiet death of an exiled prince remembered for betrayals that never succeeded. He left the world as he had lived, surrounded by plots and promises, yet ending in shadows, a life of ambition reduced to a cautionary whisper in history. He was born in splendor, but his life would always be measured against someone else's crown. Gaston Jean-Baptiste de France entered the world on April 25, 1608, at Fontainebleau, a palace dripping with symbols of Bourbon power. He was the third son of King Henry IV of France and Maria de Medici. But with the early death of his elder brother, he quickly rose to become the younger sibling of the heir, Louis XIII. From the moment of his birth, he was stamped with a paradox. Close enough to power to feel its heat, but never close enough to seize it without tearing apart the kingdom. The French court called him Monsieur. It was not just a polite title. By tradition, Monsieur was the designation for the king's younger brother, a role both gilded and cursed. It meant he lived at the very center of political life, attended with honor, bathed in riches, yet forever aware that he was number two. To be Monsieur was to be important, but not essential. Admired, but not indispensable. This shadow weighed heavily on Gaston's youth. He grew up in the aftermath of Henry IV's assassination in 1610, when his mother, Maria de Medici, became regent for the 9-year-old Louis XIII. The court was a battlefield of factions, intrigues, and whispered betrayals. For a child like Gaston, it was both intoxicating and poisonous. He was indulged by his mother, doted on by courtiers who saw in him a potential alternative to Louis. To them, Gaston was not just a charming boy. He was a contingency plan, a rival waiting in the wings should the king falter. Imagine a boy at the grand halls of the Louvre, his footsteps echoing behind his brother's, every gesture compared, every smile weighed. Louis XIII was stiff, withdrawn, and melancholic, while Gaston was animated, witty, and graceful. The contrast was obvious, and people noticed. Some whispered, "What if he had been the king?" Others, more cautious, wondered whether such brilliance could ever translate into discipline, or whether it would curdle into instability. From the beginning, Gaston was shaped by expectations too heavy for a second son. In portraits from his youth, his face is delicate, eyes bright with intelligence, posture elegant. He looks the part of a prince who could charm a room, and indeed, charm was his currency. Courtiers adored his conversation. Noble ladies were drawn to his wit, and foreign ambassadors often remarked on his easy manners compared to the cold formality of Louis XIII. Gaston seemed to embody all the qualities of a natural leader, yet beneath the surface was something more fragile. A dependence on approval, a hunger for validation, a reluctance to take risks without assurance of applause. Power, at its core, demands solitude. But Gaston feared being alone. As Louis XIII grew into his role as king, the differences between the brothers deepened. Louis was austere, reserved, often painfully shy. Gaston was dazzling, restless, eager to be loved. In the eyes of France, Louis XIII bore the crown, but Gaston bore the allure. This tension haunted both of them. To the king, Gaston was a constant reminder of how easily the nobility could prefer a different prince. To Gaston, his brother was a constant reminder that no matter how much he was admired, he would never sit on the throne unless fortune turned cruel. This imbalance bred bitterness. Every royal court needs a scapegoat, a rival, a figure through whom discontent can be expressed. Gaston became that figure. Disgruntled nobles, foreign envoys, even his own mother at times used him as a tool against Louis. They whispered promises of support, suggested futures where he might replace his brother, dangled the intoxicating idea that he was destined for more. And Gaston, young and impressionable, listened. He began to view himself not only as monsieur, but as a man cheated by fate, trapped in an orbit that denied him the sunlight of true authority. Yet he lacked the one thing ambition requires: resolve. Historians often describe Gaston as a man of contradictions. He could inspire devotion in the morning and betray his allies by nightfall. He could burn with revolutionary rhetoric one day and kneel in repentance the next. The seeds of this pattern were already visible in his youth. Raised in a court that thrived on manipulation, he learned to adapt, to bend, to promise without delivering. He became skilled at playing factions against each other, but never skilled at following a plan to its conclusion. As a young man, he attended ceremonies, tournaments, banquets. Always the glittering younger prince, always the one everyone wanted to charm. But when the feasts ended and the courtiers left, he remained restless. His brother had purpose: to rule. Gaston had spectacle, and spectacle fades quickly. The shadow of the throne is colder than its light. By the time he reached his 20s, Gaston had already cultivated a reputation as both captivating and unreliable. Some contemporaries pitied him, seeing a man trapped by circumstance, too close to the crown to be irrelevant, too far to be decisive. Others feared him, believing his ambition could one day ignite civil war. Both assessments were correct, but the truth at the heart of his life was simpler. Gaston never truly knew who he was outside the role of the king's brother. And so his story began not as a tale of power, but as a tale of longing, longing to matter, longing to be chosen, longing to step out of the shadow and into the light. That longing would shape everything he did. It would fuel his rebellions, inspire his betrayals, and ultimately condemn him to failure. Because a man who longs to be king but fears the price of kingship is a man destined to collapse under the weight of his own contradictions. Gaston of Orléans was not yet the prince of betrayals, but the stage was already set. At first glance, Gaston of Orléans seemed to have everything a court could want. He was handsome, with a quick smile and graceful bearing. His conversation sparkled. His presence lightened even the heaviest ceremonies, and his laughter carried through the echoing halls of the Louvre like music. Where Louis XIII brooded in silence, Gaston charmed with words. Where Louis appeared rigid, Gaston moved with elegance, dancing as if the court existed for his performance. People liked him. They could not help it. But liking is not the same as trusting. Beneath the charm, those closest to him saw a troubling truth. Gaston was deeply inconsistent. One day he was fiery, bold, determined to defy his brother and seize destiny. The next he was meek, hesitant, and ready to retreat into apologies. His advisors complained that he shifted like the wind. His allies warned that he could not be counted on for more than a season. Even his mother, who adored him, sighed at his inability to hold his ground. Still, in a court starved for warmth, his light shone brightly. As a young man, Gaston attracted admirers effortlessly. Noble ladies whispered about his gallantry. Foreign envoys praised his intellect. Even hardened soldiers found themselves drawn to his charisma. They saw in him a natural leader, someone who could inspire loyalty not through fear or command, but through affection. In another life, in another system, he might have become a beloved monarch. But in 17th century France, affection was not enough. The crown required iron discipline, cold calculation, and the ability to stand alone when all others had fled. Gaston had none of these. His charm was a mask, and masks cannot endure forever. Contemporaries described him as a man eager for recognition, but allergic to responsibility. He loved applause, but feared consequences. He relished being courted by rival factions, but balked at the sacrifices real leadership demanded. When asked to commit, to take risks that could not be undone, he often hesitated, and in the hesitation, he lost the moment. This pattern became visible early. At court, rumors swirled constantly. Gaston had promised to support this duke, only to secretly assure the cardinal he would remain loyal. He had pledged his word to one faction, only to vanish when they called on him to act. He lived in contradictions. He wanted to be seen as the bold alternative to Louis XIII, yet he feared the irreversible leap that boldness required. It was safer to plot, to talk, to imagine. It was riskier to strike. This weakness was not born from stupidity. Gaston was intelligent, even brilliant at times. Rather, it came from a lack of conviction. He did not know what he truly wanted, only what he did not have. And what he did not have was the throne. The throne was both his obsession and his torment. To live as the king's brother was to be forever compared, forever second. He could not escape it. Every gesture of favor from the court reminded him of his brother's higher place. Every cheer from the nobles echoed the absence of a crown on his own head. When the people adored him, it only deepened his resentment. To be loved and yet not rule, was this a blessing or a curse? In his heart, Gaston vacillated between rebellion and resignation. Sometimes he envisioned himself as the savior of France, leading nobles against tyranny, restoring liberty to the kingdom. Other times he was content to bask in the luxuries of his position, enjoying titles, wealth, and admiration without responsibility. These shifts confused his allies and enraged his enemies. To them, he seemed unreliable at best, treacherous at worst. But the truth was more pathetic than malicious. Gaston was not plotting with clarity. He was drifting with desperation. His older brother, Louis XIII, could see this. The king, reserved as he was, understood his sibling's nature better than most. He recognized the charm, but he also recognized the instability. For Louis, Gaston was both a threat and a liability. Too popular to ignore, too unreliable to empower, he hovered in the dangerous middle ground of court politics. The king knew he could never truly trust him, yet he also knew he could never entirely dismiss him. This tension poisoned their relationship. Louis XIII tolerated Gaston when it suited him, then crushed him when he became inconvenient. Gaston responded with the same pattern he would show all his life. Rebellion followed by repentance, betrayal followed by pleas for forgiveness. Each cycle deepened his reputation as a prince of instability. He was neither loyal courtier nor decisive rebel, but something murkier, a man forever in between, forever unsettled. And still, people loved him. That was the tragedy. His grace and wit ensured that, despite his flaws, the court could not resist him. He remained an object of fascination, a figure who represented both promise and disappointment. He embodied the dangerous hope that France might find another king, one more charming, more accessible, more likable. And he embodied the bitter reality that charm without conviction collapses into farce. By the time Gaston reached his mid-20s, his reputation was sealed. He was the dazzling brother, the graceful prince, the man courted by factions, yet trusted by none. In him, France saw both the seduction of alternative power and the futility of relying on it. His presence made politics volatile. His unreliability made them tragic. In this contradiction lay the seeds of his downfall. For Gaston of Orléans was never merely the charming younger brother. He was already the unstable one, the man whose brightness promised much, but whose character could not deliver. History would remember him not as the hope he inspired, but as the failure he embodied. And yet, in those years, he still believed he could rewrite his destiny. The moment would come when he would test his defiance, when charm would become weapon, when instability would masquerade as courage. That moment arrived in the form of a marriage, not of love, but of rebellion. In the rigid hierarchy of 17th century France, marriage was never just a private affair. For a prince of the blood, it was a matter of state, a political weapon, a chess piece in the great game of dynasties. Every union had to serve the crown. Every bride was chosen not by affection, but by calculation. Which is why Gaston of Orléans' choice in 1626 stunned the court like a thunderclap. He married without permission. Marie de Bourbon, Duchess of Montpensier, was no obscure noblewoman. She was one of the wealthiest heiresses in France, carrying vast lands and a fortune that could have rivaled small kingdoms. Her dowry alone was a lure that made her the most sought-after match of her generation. To Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, her hand was a prize to be allocated carefully, to bind allies or secure loyalty. They never imagined Gaston would seize it for himself. Yet he did, boldly, recklessly, defiantly. The marriage was more than a personal choice. It was an act of rebellion. Gaston had grown weary of being managed, of seeing every aspect of his life orchestrated by his brother and Richelieu. By marrying Marie de Bourbon in secret, he proclaimed his independence. It was a gesture meant to humiliate Louis, to show that the younger brother could act on his own, without royal approval. But defiance quickly turned to disaster. The union ignited a storm within the court. Louis XIII was outraged, Richelieu livid. For them, Gaston's act was not merely insolence, it was a threat to the crown itself. By marrying a fortune so immense, Gaston had potentially given himself the resources to finance rebellion. Overnight, the king's younger brother had transformed from charming nuisance into genuine danger. And then, tragedy struck. Marie de Bourbon, barely 18, died giving birth to a daughter, Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, in 1627. The young duchess left behind her fortune, which passed to the infant child. Gaston was devastated, but his grief carried a bitter undertone. His rebellion had cost him his wife, and the fortune he had sought to control slipped away into the guardianship of the crown. What was meant to be his great act of defiance dissolved into another humiliating reminder of his powerlessness. Still, the lesson did not restrain him. Years later, Gaston would once again turn marriage into rebellion. This time the bride was Marguerite of Lorraine, sister to the Duke of Lorraine, a house often at odds with France. Perched on the kingdom's volatile eastern frontier, by choosing her, Gaston was not simply making a personal decision. He was binding himself to a family seen as enemies of the crown. Worse still, he did it in secret, without papal dispensation, without royal approval, and in direct defiance of Richelieu's authority. The consequences were predictable. Louis XIII and Richelieu declared the marriage null and void. They pressured the Pope to refuse recognition. Marguerite was forced into seclusion, the union treated as if it had never happened. For Gaston, it was another humiliation. His attempt to wield marriage as a weapon against his brother backfired spectacularly, leaving him mocked, isolated, and weakened. And yet, there was a strange pattern in all this. Each time Gaston acted out, his rebellion took the form of personal drama rather than military victory. He sought to defy the crown not by leading armies into battle, but by making choices in his private life that echoed as political statements. He did not conquer cities. He married brides. He did not seize power. He flirted with it, hoping symbolic gestures might substitute for real resolve. It revealed something profound about his nature. For Gaston, rebellion was not about constructing new orders or leading revolutions. It was about proving, again and again, that he was more than a shadow. His marriages were proclamations. I exist, I can act, I can wound the crown. Yet because they lacked strategy, because they were driven by impulse more than vision, each proclamation collapsed into farce. The court saw through it. Nobles who once admired his daring began to shake their heads. Here was a prince who could provoke storms but not navigate them. Here was a man who could set fires but not keep them burning. His personal life became a theater of defiance, one that entertained the public but failed to alter the balance of power. And Gaston himself? He drifted between satisfaction and regret. When he defied the crown, he felt alive, invigorated, convinced he had finally seized control of his fate. But when the consequences closed in, annulments, humiliations, royal displeasure, he shrank. He begged forgiveness, he wept before his brother, he allowed himself to be pacified. And then, once the sting of disgrace faded, the cycle began again. It was this inconsistency, bold gestures followed by cowardly retreats, that cemented his reputation. Gaston was not feared as a ruthless rival. He was pitied as a man who mistook rebellion for romance, politics for theater. In a monarchy ruled by calculation, his impulsiveness was not only dangerous, it was useless. Still, his story was far from over. The marriages had shown his defiance, but they were only preludes. For the next act of Gaston's life would not take place in the privacy of a chapel, but on the battlefield of politics itself. Factions of nobles, restless under Richelieu's iron grip, would look to him as their champion. They would ask him to lead, to stand, to be more than charming or impulsive. And once again, Gaston would face the test that defined his existence. Could he move beyond gestures into action? Could he transform defiance into power? The answer, history would show, was always the same. Every monarchy fears its own blood. Foreign enemies can be fought on battlefields. Rebellious nobles can be crushed in open war. But a prince of the blood, a brother, an uncle, a son, is more dangerous. His very existence carries legitimacy. His name alone can spark uprisings. In 17th century France, Gaston of Orléans embodied this threat, not because he was ruthless, not because he was cunning, but because he was available. Time and again, factions found him useful. When nobles, dukes, or discontented governors grew weary of Cardinal Richelieu's iron control, they needed a banner, a figurehead who could lend their cause royal weight. Gaston was perfect. He was charming enough to inspire followers. He was royal enough to legitimize rebellion. And, most importantly, he was unreliable enough to be manipulated. The great irony of his life was that he was never the master of his conspiracies. He was the pawn. The rebellions began early. In the late 1620s and 1630s, Gaston attached himself to a series of plots against Richelieu. One year, he promised loyalty to the king. The next year, he whispered with malcontents, hinting at his willingness to join their cause. He made pledges, signed agreements, and declared himself ready to fight. But when the moment of confrontation arrived, he hesitated. He delayed, excused himself, or simply abandoned the field. Allies were left exposed, enemies emboldened. It became a rhythm. Gaston announced, Gaston withdrew, Gaston begged forgiveness. The Day of Dupes in 1630 revealed this pattern vividly. That autumn, a coalition of nobles, supported by the Queen Mother Maria de' Medici, tried to oust Richelieu from power. Gaston stood with them. For a moment, it seemed the cardinal's downfall was imminent. Paris buzzed with rumors of Richelieu's flight. Gaston's supporters envisioned him as the liberator of France from ministerial tyranny. But Richelieu did not fall. The king chose his cardinal over his mother, over his brother, over the nobles. In the aftermath, Gaston fled into exile. His courage collapsing, the instant victory slipped away. Months later, humbled and desperate, he threw himself at Louis XIII's mercy, once more forgiven, once more returned to court, and once more distrusted. It was always the same. Conspiracy followed conspiracy. In 1632, Gaston supported the Duke of Montmorency in a rebellion in Languedoc. Again, hope soared. Again, defeat was swift. Montmorency was executed, and Gaston, true to form, begged for pardon. He received it. But with each cycle, his reputation darkened. The nobles began to joke that following Gaston was a death sentence. He was the prince who promised everything and delivered nothing, who marched at the head of armies only to vanish when the swords were drawn. And yet, they kept turning to him. Why? Because even failure has value in politics. Gaston's very presence allowed malcontents to dream. His bloodline gave cover to their ambitions. Even if he betrayed them, his name had already attracted supporters, already drawn attention, already weakened the crown's unity. To Richelieu, Gaston was like a chronic illness, not fatal in himself, but endlessly draining, impossible to eradicate. This reputation earned him a title history has never let him shed: the Prince of Betrayals. It was not betrayal in the cold, calculating sense of treason. It was betrayal born of weakness, of indecision, of a man who wanted the glory of rebellion without the terror of its cost. Gaston betrayed because he feared choosing. He betrayed because he loved to be courted by all sides and could not endure cutting ties with any. To some, this made him contemptible. To others, pitiable. To all, it made him dangerous. The paradox grew sharper as the years passed. Louis XIII, though weary of his brother, never destroyed him outright. Execution would have made him a martyr. Permanent exile would have left him a rallying point abroad. Instead, the king kept him close, alternately forgiving and humiliating him, binding him to the court while stripping him of influence. It was a cruel mercy, to be near power yet denied it, to be essential yet despised. Gaston endured it because he had no choice, but each year his bitterness grew. He was not alone. Throughout the 1630s and 1640s, France was a kingdom under pressure. Wars against Spain drained resources. Heavy taxes stirred resentment. Richelieu's centralization crushed the old liberties of the nobles. Discontent simmered everywhere, and in every plot, Gaston's name surfaced. Sometimes he played an active role, sending letters, making promises, raising troops. Sometimes he was only invoked, his name written at the top of manifestos without his knowledge. He had become less a man than a symbol, the embodiment of royal descent, the perpetual other prince. The irony was cruel. Gaston longed to be king, to step into the light, to rule with dignity. Instead, he became a ghostly presence in the politics of his age, summoned whenever resistance needed a figurehead, discarded whenever real decisions had to be made. His instability, which had once seemed like flexibility, hardened into farce. He was no longer the charming alternative. He was the unreliable constant. And yet, France was not done with him. By the 1640s, a new generation was rising. Louis XIII's health was failing. The child who would become Louis XIV was growing, fragile and vulnerable. And in the chaos of transition, when the crown seemed uncertain, Gaston glimpsed opportunity once again. The stage was set for the greatest rebellion of his life, a civil war that would shake France to its core. But the question remained, the same question that haunted him from youth. Would Gaston finally find the courage to act, or would he once again collapse into betrayal? Failure followed Gaston of Orléans like a shadow that lengthened with every year. It was not that he lacked opportunity. On the contrary, fortune seemed to place him, again and again, at the very edge of power. He was invited into conspiracies, courted by factions, begged by nobles to lead their cause. His bloodline gave him legitimacy, his charm gave him followers, and his brother's stern rule gave him reasons to rebel. But opportunity without resolve is only an illusion. And Gaston, for all his brilliance, never managed to cross the line between possibility and achievement. Every rebellion ended the same way, in humiliation. Take the uprising of 1632 in Languedoc. Gaston threw his support behind Henri II de Montmorency, a powerful duke with strong military backing. For a moment, it seemed like a serious threat to Richelieu and the crown. Gaston was there, at the heart of it, the prince who might finally seize destiny. But when the armies clashed at Castelnaudary, Gaston hesitated. Montmorency fought bravely, was captured, and was executed. Gaston, meanwhile, abandoned the cause. He did not die in battle, did not share his allies' fate, did not even stand by the men who had risked their lives for him. Instead, he fled. When the dust settled, he once again threw himself on Louis XIII's mercy. And once again, astonishingly, he was pardoned. The cycle was exhausting, not only for Gaston, but for everyone around him. Nobles who once trusted his word began to laugh bitterly at the mention of it. To ally with Monsieur, they whispered, is to sign one's own death warrant. His name became synonymous with betrayal, not because he plotted brilliantly, but because he collapsed predictably. He was the kind of ally who disappeared at the first hint of danger, who left others to suffer the punishment while he sought forgiveness. It is telling that Richelieu himself, ruthless, calculating, unforgiving Richelieu, once remarked that Gaston was less an enemy than a nuisance. He cannot finish what he begins, the cardinal observed. And so, he destroys only those who trust him. For Richelieu, Gaston was not a rival to be feared, but a liability to be contained. And yet, somehow, Gaston remained central. Despite his failures, he could never be fully cast aside. He was, after all, the king's brother. He could never be executed without scandal, never be exiled without risk of foreign entanglements, never be ignored without creating an alternative rallying point. So Louis XIII tolerated him, Richelieu managed him, and the nobility alternately courted and cursed him. Gaston was indispensable precisely because he was useless, a paradox that defined his entire existence. His failures were not confined to politics. They seeped into his personal life as well. He failed as a husband. His first marriage to Marie de Bourbon ended in tragedy, her death leaving him both bereaved and politically weakened. His secret marriage to Marguerite of Lorraine was annulled, mocked, and turned into yet another scandal. He failed as a father, too. His children grew up with the weight of his reputation, their futures constrained by the shame of his choices. Even in private, Gaston seemed incapable of holding steady. He shifted moods constantly, now jubilant, now despondent, now scheming, now repentant. Those closest to him complained that he was impossible to rely on, even in the smallest matters. The court began to view him less as a prince and more as a cautionary tale. And yet, there was always another chance, always another conspiracy, always another moment when the tides of history seemed to offer him redemption. That is what made Gaston's life so haunting. He was never irrelevant. His failures did not exile him to obscurity. Instead, they kept him perpetually at the center of events, a man forever on the cusp of greatness, forever tumbling back into disgrace. It is difficult to overstate the frustration he inspired. To his supporters, he was maddening. To his enemies, he was infuriating. To his brother, he was exhausting. Everyone around him recognized his gifts, his charm, his intelligence, his natural ability to attract loyalty. And everyone knew he would squander them. He was like a general who draws up brilliant battle plans and then abandons the field before the first shot is fired. His failures were not glorious. They were anticlimactic. Unlike rebels who die in dramatic defeats, Gaston lived to repent. Unlike princes who gamble everything and lose their heads, he always survived. But survival was its own punishment. Each time he crawled back to court, each time he begged forgiveness, each time he accepted humiliation, he diminished himself. By the 1640s, he was no longer seen as a rival, but as a joke. His name no longer inspired fear, only weariness. Still, failure has its uses. Louis XIII used Gaston's weakness as a lesson in loyalty. Richelieu used his failures as proof of the futility of resisting centralized power, and history itself would later use him as a symbol of what happens when ambition is unmoored from conviction. He became less a man than an allegory, the eternal prince of betrayals, the reminder that power without resolve is nothing more than vanity. And yet, in the story of France, his role was not finished. For after Richelieu's death in 1642, and after Louis XIII followed him to the grave in 1643, the kingdom entered a dangerous transition. The heir to the throne, Louis XIV, was only a child. Power passed into the hands of his mother, Anne of Austria, and the Cardinal Mazarin. The nobles smelled weakness. The old resentments boiled to the surface. France teetered on the edge of civil war, and once again, eyes turned to Gaston of Orléans. Would this be his chance? Would the brother of the late king, the uncle of the boy king, finally seize the moment that had eluded him for decades? For a brief, intoxicating time, it seemed possible. The storm that would come to be known as La Fronde was rising, and Gaston, ever the prince of conspiracies, stepped into the chaos. But history had already written his role. The man of failures would remain a man of failures. And though the stage was larger, the script would play out the same. The death of Louis XIII in 1643 did not bring peace to France. It brought uncertainty. The new king, Louis XIV, was only 5 years old. The regency passed to his mother, Anne of Austria, with Cardinal Mazarin as her chief minister. The kingdom suddenly had a child on the throne and a foreign-born queen in charge. For ambitious nobles, it was an invitation. For Gaston of Orléans, it was temptation itself. At last, he thought, the moment had come. He was no longer the younger brother of a reigning king. He was now the uncle of a boy too young to rule, the senior male of the royal family, the man closest in blood to the throne. For the first time in his life, he stood in a position where France might need him. It seemed destiny had finally delivered the chance that had eluded him for decades. And destiny delivered it in the form of La Fronde. The Fronde, from the French word for a child's slingshot, was a series of revolts that rocked France between 1648 and 1653. It was born from resentment against Mazarin's financial policies, his foreign origins, and his grip on the young king. But it was more than that. It was a struggle between the crown and the nobility, between central authority and aristocratic privilege. France descended into chaos. Barricades in Paris, armies raised in defiance, princes challenging the throne itself. In this storm, Gaston once again became the figurehead. Nobles looked to him as the natural leader of resistance. He had the bloodline, he had the popularity, he had the position of royal uncle. And unlike the child king, he was an adult, a man who could, in theory, take decisive command. To his supporters, Gaston could be the regent France needed, the alternative to Mazarin's hated rule. But theory was not reality. The same flaws that had haunted him for years resurfaced at the worst possible time. Gaston hesitated. He drifted between factions. He promised support, then withdrew. He let opportunities slip through his fingers. At one moment he stood at the head of Parisian rebels. At the next, he negotiated with Mazarin. His inconsistency drained the rebellion of coherence. What could have been a decisive challenge to royal authority became, under his influence, a muddle of betrayals, reconciliations, and wasted chances. And yet, for a brief moment, power truly seemed within his grasp. In 1649, as Paris erupted in barricades, Gaston marched through the city streets, greeted as a liberator. Crowds cheered him. Banners proclaimed his name. For a man who had spent his life in the shadow of others, it must have felt intoxicating. Here, at last, he was not merely the brother, not merely the pawn. He was the Prince of Paris, the man who could make the crown bend. The city adored him, and his enemies feared what he might do. But fear requires action, and action was what Gaston never delivered. Instead of pressing his advantage, he allowed events to drift. He negotiated when he should have fought, delayed when he should have struck. Allies pleaded with him to lead decisively. He wavered. Soldiers who had sworn to him melted away in disillusionment. The people who once shouted his name turned sullen, sensing his weakness. And Mazarin, ever patient, used the time Gaston wasted to regroup, to divide the rebels, to win back the upper hand. By 1653, the Fronde had collapsed. The royal authority emerged not weaker, but stronger. Mazarin returned in triumph. Anne of Austria solidified her regency, and the young Louis XIV learned an unforgettable lesson. Never again would he allow nobles the chance to challenge the throne. For Gaston, the Fronde was not only his last great opportunity, it was his final humiliation. He had been handed the chance of a lifetime, the loyalty of Paris, the legitimacy of blood, the energy of rebellion, and he squandered it. His failure was not due to lack of resources or lack of support. It was due to himself. His indecision, his craving for reconciliation, his inability to risk everything doomed him once more. Historians often call the Fronde a rehearsal for the French Revolution a century later, a glimpse of what might happen when nobles and people rise against the crown. If that is true, then Gaston's role was to show how rebellion could be wasted by weakness. He turned potential revolution into temporary inconvenience. He transformed fire into smoke. After the Fronde, his reputation was beyond repair. Even those who had once admired his charm now saw him clearly. He was not the savior of France. He was not even a serious rival. He was the embodiment of futility, the man who could never finish what he began. His enemies no longer needed to fear him. They pitied him. His allies no longer dreamed of his triumphs. They braced for his betrayals. And so, the crown delivered its final judgment. Louis XIV, growing into his role as king, understood better than anyone the danger of leaving Gaston at large. Execution would have made him a martyr. Exile abroad would have turned him into a rallying point. The solution was subtler and crueler. Confinement. Not in a dungeon, not in chains, but in quiet isolation. In 1652, Gaston was ordered to reside at the Château de Blois, far from the center of power, watched but not tormented, alive but irrelevant. It was the perfect punishment for a man who craved attention, to be ignored. And there, in the echoing halls of Blois, the last chapter of Gaston's life began. He had failed in rebellion, failed in politics, failed in marriage, failed in ambition. What remained was only the slow erosion of a man once dazzling, now forgotten. But history is cruel in its irony, for in being exiled, Gaston fulfilled his brother's old prophecy, that he would never be destroyed by his enemies, only by himself. No executioner's blade, no public disgrace, no trial in front of jeering crowds. The punishment chosen for Gaston of Orléans was subtler, quieter, and far more enduring: exile in the shadowed halls of Blois. In 1652, after the chaos of the Fronde had finally burned itself out, the crown needed to secure the kingdom. Louis XIV was no longer a fragile child, but a young man learning to rule, guided by Mazarin's iron hand. The nobles were subdued, the city of Paris cowed, and order restored. But what to do with Gaston, the eternal conspirator, the prince who had lent his name to rebellion time and again? Killing him outright would have been dangerous. He was, after all, the king's uncle, a prince of the blood, a son of Henry IV. His death might spark sympathy, his martyrdom might inspire yet another round of unrest. Sending him abroad would have been worse. In foreign courts, he could serve as a living alternative, a Bourbon prince waiting in exile to be used against France. So the crown chose silence. Blois was not a prison, at least not in the ordinary sense. It was a chateau, grand and elegant, with fine chambers and gardens. But for Gaston, it was a gilded cage. He could not leave without permission. He could not return to Paris. He could not involve himself in politics. He was watched, but not tormented. Isolated, but not tortured. He was given just enough comfort to dull the sharpness of resentment, and just enough emptiness to remind him daily of what he had lost. The cruelty lay in the contrast. From the fevered halls of Parisian rebellion, from the thrill of hearing his name shouted on barricaded streets, Gaston was reduced to wandering, echoing corridors in semi-retirement. No courtiers jostling for his favor. No armies waiting for his command. Only the whispers of servants, the creak of old timbers, the chill of Loire Valley winters pressing against the stone walls. For a man like Gaston, exile was worse than death. He had lived his life in the glow of attention. Every scheme, every marriage, every betrayal had been performed on the stage of French politics. To be relevant, even as a failure, was to be alive. Now, he was irrelevant, his audience gone. The court no longer spoke his name. Nobles no longer sought his blessing. Even his enemies had moved on, directing their hatred toward new targets. He was forgotten in real time, watching his own disappearance. The irony was sharp. Gaston had wanted to be king, but in Blois, he was less than even an ordinary noble. The chateau itself became a mirror of his decline. Once a royal residence of grandeur, by the mid-17th century, it was falling out of favor, its glory fading compared to the splendor of Paris and Versailles. Its aging walls, its quiet chambers, its neglected gardens, all reflected Gaston's condition. He, too, was once central, dazzling, admired. Now, like Blois, he was a relic, bypassed by history. Visitors who came to see him noted his bitterness. He spent his days reminiscing about past intrigues, retelling old plots as though they had been victories rather than humiliations. He spoke with pride of his role in rebellions, but his listeners, polite though they were, knew the truth. Each story was a tale of failure. Some said he grew paranoid, convinced he was still watched by Mazarin's spies. Others said he grew melancholic, lapsing into long silences as though words themselves had betrayed him. Physically, too, he began to decay. The years of stress, the disappointments, the restless shifting between triumph and collapse had worn his body thin. Illness plagued him. Accounts from the time describe him as suffering from fevers, intestinal troubles, and lung afflictions. His once graceful bearing stooped, his once sparkling eyes dulled. He was only in his 40s, but he looked far older. The energy that had once made him so captivating dwindled into frailty. And yet the punishment was not total isolation. He still had his family. His daughters visited him. His household maintained a semblance of dignity. He was not left in chains or thrown into darkness. This was not the Tower of London, but that almost made it worse. For every comfort, every luxury, every reminder of noble privilege mocked him. He had all the trappings of a prince, but none of the power. He had the appearance of grandeur, but not the substance. Perhaps the most painful part was watching from afar as the crown flourished without him. From Blois, he heard reports of Louis XIV's rise. The young king was growing into the role Gaston had once coveted. Where Gaston hesitated, Louis was decisive. Where Gaston wavered, Louis acted. The court that had once toyed with Gaston's charm now rallied unquestioningly behind the boy who would become the Sun King. Every letter, every courier, every whispered report carried the same message. France was moving forward, and Gaston was not part of it. He had spent his life trying to disrupt the monarchy. Now the monarchy thrived without him, stronger than ever. In that realization lay the deepest cruelty of his exile. He was not just irrelevant, he was disproved. His life had been a long argument that France needed someone like him. Charming, pliable, princely. But France had chosen otherwise, and it prospered in his absence. Exile is not always measured in distance. Sometimes it is measured in irrelevance. Gaston lived in exile not only from Paris, but from history itself. And so, in the silent halls of Blois, the Prince of Betrayals aged, waiting for an ending that would come not in battle or in glory, but in the slow decay of a body and the deeper decay of memory. He had once dreamed of being king. Instead, he became a ghost, haunting his own life. By the late 1650s, Gaston of Orléans was no longer the brilliant younger brother of a king, no longer the dangerous conspirator of the Fronde. He was simply an aging man in a forgotten chateau, his name fading as quickly as his body. The rebellion of his youth had turned into the silence of his exile. And the once dazzling prince now lived out his days surrounded not by courtiers, but by shadows. Blois had become his cage, but it was also his mirror. The chateau's grand architecture, once filled with the energy of royal life, had grown quiet. Empty corridors echoed with footsteps that belonged only to servants. Gardens once alive with chatter now held only the rustle of wind. In this stillness, Gaston lived like a man trapped in the ruins of his own ambition. Every stone seemed to whisper, "You were meant for more." And yet here you are. His health began to decline. Years of stress and failure had left their mark. Records from contemporaries speak of recurring fevers, violent stomach ailments, and respiratory problems. His body weakened, his movements slowed, and the charm that had once been his greatest weapon dimmed into frailty. To visitors, he no longer looked like the gallant prince who once inspired noble factions. He looked like an old man before his time, worn out by dreams that had turned to dust. His spirit, too, eroded. For a man who had lived on attention, neglect was poison. He still received occasional visitors, daughters, loyal household members, a scattering of nobles who came out of duty. But there was no court around him, no theater of politics to sustain him. In conversation, he drifted constantly back to the past. He spoke of conspiracies as if they had been victories, of alliances as if they had endured, of rebellions as if they had been noble causes rather than humiliations. To his listeners, these stories sounded like excuses. To Gaston, they were all he had left. The present offered him nothing. Only the past gave him identity. Even in decline, he could not escape comparison. From afar, he heard reports of his nephew Louis XIV, the boy who had once been fragile, now growing into power. The young king's court was glittering, dynamic, filled with vision. Louis was learning lessons from the failures of his uncle. He centralized authority, crushed noble dissent, and built the monarchy into an unshakable institution. Where Gaston had been weak, Louis was strong. Where Gaston had been indecisive, Louis was absolute. Each success of the Sun King was a reminder of Gaston's irrelevance. It must have been torture to hear. Once, Gaston had imagined himself as the rightful ruler of France. Now he was reduced to reading reports of another man's glory, another man's triumphs. He had longed to be a king, but history had chosen otherwise. The bitter irony was that his failures had helped shape the monarchy that excluded him. By rebelling and faltering, he had shown the crown the dangers of divided authority. Louis XIV learned the lesson well. Never allow a prince of the blood to wield independent power. Gaston became both the warning and the justification for absolutism. His decline was not dramatic. It was slow, quiet, almost invisible. He did not fall in battle. He did not meet the scaffold. He did not vanish in exile to foreign lands. Instead, he faded, year by year, in the stillness of Blois. His strength ebbed, his ambitions evaporated, his body decayed. What remained was a man who had once been central to France, now reduced to a ghost wandering through his own disappointments. And yet, even in fading, there was something tragic. Because Gaston was not a villain. He was not Richelieu's equal, nor Mazarin's rival, nor Louis XIII's mortal enemy. He was, in many ways, a victim of his own contradictions. He wanted power, but feared its price. He loved attention, but dreaded responsibility. He rebelled, but lacked the courage to endure rebellion's consequences. His tragedy was not cruelty, but weakness. The quiet, corrosive weakness of a man who could never decide what he truly wanted. By the late 1650s, his illnesses grew worse. Contemporary accounts speak of violent fevers and internal ailments that left him bedridden. His attendants reported bouts of exhaustion, difficulty breathing, and a constant state of malaise. Physicians tried what remedies they could: poultices, bleeding, herbal infusions. But nothing reversed the decline. His body was failing, and with it, the last vestiges of his once sparkling persona. The world outside moved on. Louis XIV was preparing to take full control of the monarchy, stepping out from his mother's regency into his own reign. The court, the nobles, the people of Paris, they all turned their gaze toward the rising Sun King. Few spared a thought for Gaston in Blois. He was yesterday's prince, yesterday's conspirator, yesterday's threat. And so he faded, quietly, painfully, like a candle burning down to its wick. Visitors described him in those final years as alternately irritable and melancholic, sometimes railing against his fate, sometimes retreating into silence. There was no triumph left to claim, no conspiracy left to join, no reconciliation left to beg. Only the slow passage of time, the daily erosion of strength, the awareness that his story was almost over. It was not the ending he had imagined, but it was the ending he had made. And so, as the winter of 1660 approached, Gaston of Orléans, once the charming younger brother, once the prince of betrayals, once the perpetual rival, lay dying. His body, weakened by years of failure, could no longer resist. His spirit, worn thin by exile and neglect, had no fight left. The man who had lived in the shadow of a throne was finally stepping into the shadow of death. On February 2nd, 1660, the long unraveling of Gaston of Orléans reached its quiet end. He had been ill for weeks. Fevers gripped him, his breathing grew labored, and his strength ebbed away. The physicians of Blois, men trained in ritual remedies more than modern science, applied their bleeding cups, their herbal infusions, their poultices. Nothing worked. His body was exhausted, hollowed out by years of disappointments and illness. To those who attended him, it was clear. The prince who had once carried the hope and the danger of France was slipping into his final hours. There was no crowd outside his chambers, no Parisian mobs gathering in anticipation, no noble factions plotting to raise his banner once more. Instead, there was only stillness. A few attendants, some family members, a scattering of clergy. The silence of Blois was total, broken only by the faint sound of coughing, the shuffle of servants' feet, the whisper of prayers murmured over his bed. For a man who had spent his life in pursuit of the spotlight, the darkness of anonymity was the harshest fate of all. He died at the age of 51, not old by the standards of his time, but aged far beyond his years by the weight of his own contradictions. Those who saw his body remarked on the hollowness of his face, the gauntness that had replaced the once charming features of the young prince. It was not the face of a conqueror, nor of a martyr. It was the face of a man worn down by unfulfilled ambition, eaten alive not by enemies, but by hesitation. And then came the strangest part. Almost nothing happened. For a royal prince, the younger brother of a king, the uncle of a reigning monarch, one might have expected a grand funeral. One might have imagined processions through Paris, solemn bells tolling in Notre Dame, a nation pausing to honor the blood of Henry IV. But none of that occurred. His death passed quietly, with little fanfare. There was no public mourning, no wave of grief, no sense of national loss. France, quite simply, had moved on. The young Louis XIV was on the cusp of assuming full control of the kingdom. Mazarin was still alive, still guiding the monarchy with a steady hand. The court was already focused on the dazzling rise of the boy who would become the Sun King. In such a moment, Gaston was an afterthought, a relic of rebellions best forgotten. His funeral was modest, his memory quickly buried beneath the splendor of the new reign. It was as though the crown itself wanted him erased. The official notices of his death were restrained, almost perfunctory. Courtiers paid their respects, but without the passion or grief that had marked other royal deaths. His passing was treated less as the loss of a vital prince and more as the closing of an awkward chapter. The crown made no effort to elevate him into legend, no attempt to cast his life in noble terms. Instead, the silence spoke volumes. He was gone, and the kingdom was relieved. For his family, the grief was private. His daughters wept, his household mourned. But beyond the walls of Blois, few cared. The people of Paris, who had once cheered his name on barricaded streets, barely noticed. The nobles, who had once plotted under his banner, turned their attention to new ambitions. Even his enemies, Richelieu and Mazarin, were long dead or near death. The rivalries that had once defined his life had already dissolved into history. Death had robbed him not only of life, but of relevance. And yet, in a way, his final moments fit the pattern of his existence. He had spent his life making grand gestures that collapsed into nothing. He had spent his career raising hopes only to disappoint them. His death was simply the ultimate extension of that story. An event that should have been grand, that should have mattered, that should have resounded through France. But instead, slipped by, almost unnoticed. It was as though history itself had grown tired of him. But silence can be its own kind of epitaph, for in dying quietly, without glory or spectacle, Gaston became the very symbol of wasted potential. His story was not about triumph or martyrdom. It was about what happens when ambition burns without resolve, when charm substitutes for conviction, when rebellion is more theater than reality. His death crystallized that lesson. A man may spend his life chasing the throne, but without the courage to grasp it, he will vanish into obscurity. In the end, the uncle of Louis XIV died not as a rival, not as a hero, not even as a traitor. He died as something smaller, sadder, more human. A man who could never decide who he truly was, and as the bells of Blois tolled faintly, carrying news of his passing only to a handful of ears, France did not stop. The monarchy did not pause. The kingdom did not falter. History moved forward, and Gaston of Orléans slipped backward into silence. History remembers Gaston of Orléans with neither reverence nor hatred, but with weary disappointment. He was the prince who might have changed France, yet never did. He rebelled, but without conviction. He betrayed, but without vision. He dreamed of a crown, but feared the price it demanded. His life became the cautionary tale of what happens when charm replaces strength, when indecision corrodes ambition, when a man seeks glory but cannot bear its weight. For Louis XIV, his nephew, Gaston's failures were lessons etched in stone. The Sun King ruled with absolute authority precisely because he had seen the chaos of a weak prince. He centralized power, silenced noble dissent, and allowed no brother, no cousin, no uncle to rival him. Gaston, in his endless betrayals and humiliations, had taught France the necessity of strength, and in doing so, consigned himself to irrelevance. And yet, behind the scorn, one can glimpse something human. Gaston was not cruel. He was fragile. He did not destroy others. He destroyed himself. His tragedy was not villainy, but weakness. The kind of weakness we all fear in ourselves. The failure to become what we might have been. In that, his silence still speaks.